William Nixon is the 3 times great-grandfather to my daughters Anna, Lynette, Catherine and Alison. William was born on the 15th of February 1821 in Lakenham, Norfolk. William's daughter Millicent married Perry Robert St Quintin, who is the son of the surveyor and auctioneer Perry St Quintin. William's family was well connected locally in the East Anglian region, and he was well educated. That said, he is very much a self-made man. In his early career, he worked for a prominent abolitionist against slavery, and then went on to become governor of the London Hospital, made famous as the last destination of Jack the Ripper's victims, and also for John Merrick, better known as the Elephant Man. What follows is a brief autobiography called Rough Notes on Self, dictated in 1903 following his retirement. The document was given to me by Colin McCorn, William's great-great-granddaughter. Having investigated this family tree, it's important to record the fascinating history of the St Quintins, because I'm starting to see repeating patterns of careers and personalities. I hope this is as entertaining as it is enlightening, and perhaps it might inspire you to investigate your own family tree to help preserve the memory of your loved ones.
Brighton, England, 1903.
I propose, if time be granted to me for the work, to put down somewhat in detail the events of my own life. This I have decided to do because it will be a means of showing what vicissitudes may occur in the career of an unknown, little recognized, and altogether ordinary individual, and be thus the means of showing, for the benefit of my readers, should any such there be, that no one need despair of realizing what seems improbable and apparently unattainable, that occasionally the hour and the man may come together and prove the truth of the assertion that nothing is certain but the unforeseen. I believe I'm entitled to state in the wording of the ordinary formula that I am the son of poor but honest parents, but to make this still more clear, I'll go a little further back about my earlier progenitors. My paternal grandfather was, as far as I ever gathered, engaged in trade of some kind at Wisbeach, Isle of Ely, and his business would seem to have been somewhat profitable, for after bringing up a family of 12 children, of whom my father was the youngest, he decided to start his last offset of his race in the ranks of a profession, but evidently his means must have lessened, for having paid the usual fees for articling my father as a lawyer's clerk, he started him in life with his blessing, a small amount of pocket money, and a suit of clothes. The lawyer lived in the dull and monotonous town of Lynn Regis, and therefore I suppose my father would have lived in the ultimate pursuit of his profession, but for an event which suddenly altered his arrangements. His master died 2 or 3 years after his articles had commenced, and, as his apprenticeship had to be concluded somewhere, he was transferred to the office of the town clerk of Norwich, a circumstance which led to events which, in my own case, probably altered the whole face of my personal career. Of my paternal grandfather, I only remember that he was a broad-shouldered, powerful old man who, at the age of 50, walked from Wisbeach to Norwich, a distance of 30 miles, to pay a visit to my father, and when staying with him in St Andrew Street, employed me every morning to pump the ice-cold spring water over his head, that he might not miss his daily habit of going to the bank of the stream, which ran at the foot of the garden, and plunging his head into the water through a hole in the ice when needed. My maternal grandfather was, I understood, an officer employed in the customs house at Lynn. Him I never saw, but an ivory miniature portrait showed him to me as a singularly handsome man, with his hair drawn into a queue, which projected over the collar of his coat and ended with a bow of ribbon. During my father's earliest clerkship in Lynn, he became attached to the daughter of the above old customs house officer, afterwards my mother, from whom I derived such of the qualities as have gifted me with persevering determination. So truly did great nonconformist preacher Mr Binney say, when referring to Sir Fowell Buxton, It has been often stated that the boy is father to the man, but I go further than this and I tell you that the mother is father to the boy. Eventually, with what must have been the narrowest possible means of living, my father took lodgings in Norwich, married, and soon after looked out for a small suitable cottage, and in the suburb of Lakenham found one nearly finished, possession of which was guaranteed by the middle of the following February, and had to remove there in the midst of a bitter winter, with the ground covered deep in snow. On entering, how great was his dismay to find that the house inside was scarcely habitable. The walls streaming with water, and hardly one stove set in the house. The room to be inhabited by my mother more like a barn than a bedroom. Every effort was made by my father and my mother's aunt, Miss Morley, who brought me up, to make preparations for an expected event. A fire was lighted in the hearth, and, as a shield against the bitter winds outside, blankets were hung around the four-posted bed. And in the due course, in the morning of February 15th, 1821, the subject of these rude memoirs entered upon life literally an instance, we may suppose, of the survival of the fittest. A little later, my father moved to a somewhat better house, and there, as if to prove the truth of his singularly superstitious views of things which led him to believe that it was unlucky to go beneath a ladder, I was doing so in our backyard when a half-brick dropped by labourers above fell on my unprotected head, which must have been somewhat thick, for in a very few days I recovered. My education here commenced when I was but 3 years old, first at a child's school close to my father's house, and afterwards a little farther off, to which I was taken by a servant who, as a great treat, allowed me to walk along the top of the garden wall of the schoolhouse, which, strange to say, was only 20 yards from the back of the house in which my future wife with her father and mother sometimes resided. This also was in Lakenham, so I return now to my father's affairs. He developed such ability in his profession that at the end of his term of legal apprenticeship the town clerk retained him as a manager with a salary, in which position he remained several years. And here I may say that casually I propose to refer to any man of mark, however humble, with whom I may have come in contact. One day when my father and the town clerk of Norwich were at work together in his office, a sprightly little red-haired lad entered and begged to see the town clerk. "Well, my man," said this gentleman, "what do you want?" "Please, sir, I want something to do." "What's your name, my lad?" "Ware Lockhart Mendham, sir." "Where do you live?" "Mattershall, sir." "When did you come from there?" "This morning, sir." "How did you come, my lad?" "Walked over early, sir, all the way." "Well, what's your father?" "Please, sir," speaking very rapidly, "he's parish clerk, rector, gravedigger, bell-ringer, a blacksmith and wheelwright." "Well, that's enough for one man," said the town clerk, "but you seem a sharp lad." "Oh, yes, sir, very sharp indeed, sir." "Can you read and write well?" "Both, sir." "Then," said the town clerk, "perhaps we can make something of this lad. Nixon, set him at that desk and let him write something to us asking for employment at such pay we may find him worth." In that occupation this sharp lad remained, saving money all the while, till he left to become article clerk to my father, who had taken out his certificate as a lawyer, and thereafter the sharp lad himself became a lawyer and town clerk of Norwich, and married the sister of a schoolfellow of my own, who was made member for Norwich. I may add that so earnest was the desire of Mr. Wendham to make himself, without education, presentable among his fellows, that he induced me, whom he had often nursed in bygone years, to coach him up in Latin sufficiently for his requirements. My father's ability in the town clerk's office having become known, he was in a position to take a fairly good house in St. Giles's Street, Norwich, adjoining the churchyard, and of the St. Giles's Church he was ultimately appointed churchwarden. As a lad of some 9 or 10 years, I was soon able to become acquainted with all the people connected with the work of the church. I had the full run of the belfry and the tower, and through my friendship with the sexton, I was able to state that I am probably one of the only persons living whom I can say has ever rung the curfew bell. In this ancient custom I was, unknown to the crowd outside, who would probably have thought it sacrilege, the active agent on many occasions. But this was not my only duty on the borders of the aristocratic St. Giles's Church, for, by the courtesy of my friend the sexton, I was allowed to take part, as opportunity offered, in the healthy occupation of grave digging, and this was a very satisfactory arrangement for my sexton's friend, inasmuch as when the sides of the grave had been boarded up to prevent the earth caving in, it was my custom to descend to the bottom and throw the earth upon an intermediate stage of boards, whence it was thrown out by a subordinate sexton to the superior officer above, who there smoked his pipe in peace. But I became for a time a grave digger on a large scale, for about this period, 1830, the first great outbreak of cholera occurred in this country, being very virulent in Newcastle, to which place Dr. Cobb, whom I knew many years after as senior physician at the London Hospital, was sent by the government at the head of a committee of investigation to draw up a report of the symptoms and treatment of this terrible disease. In due time the mysterious malady spread to Norwich, a place then ill-drained and with an extremely defective water supply. In this city the evil spread with formidable rapidity, and bodies were hurried to the grave in black boxes, in carts, or in hand barrows, to be lowered into large pits wherever space could be obtained in the various churchyards. This was a grandfired day for me, for all my time out of the small school to which I then went daily was spent in digging large trenches, say 6 feet wide and 12 feet long, in which the bodies of the poor victims were lowered side by side and tier above tier, and I well remember watching from our windows to see the celebrated violin player Paganini, who discoursed marvellous music upon one string only, pass by on the other side in his long black coat and his long curling black hair, while between him and me were passing hand barrows carried by men conveying coffins to the adjoining churchyard, where I had helped prepare this last resting place for the silent passengers. May I not perhaps here also note that I am, however, probably not only one of the few surviving curfew bell ringers of the country, but also one of the few surviving grave diggers during the first cholera epidemic in this country. It interests me further to mention that on the borders of this churchyard I became acquainted with my first smoking companion, a gentleman who lived on the top of a wall which separated my father's wash-house from the churchyard of St. Giles's. I refer to the chimney of this wash-house, with whom I smoked in company, a station which I gained after climbing up the wash-house tiles, there to secrete myself from the view of my angry father, while I pursued my apprenticeship to one of my lifelong occupations. As a hint to antigenarians, it may here be mentioned that the cigars of that period were the roughest specimens of Havana make, giving great difficulties in the drawing, this occupation being facilitated in the case of those smoked by my father by the insertion of a long tube made, I think, of rye straw. At this time I was nearly 10 years old and was daily sent to a very fair school where I got a decent knowledge of the 3 R's, and my father, who had become somewhat prosperous, had no difficulty in paying ordinary school fees, but nothing more. He now became acquainted with a gentleman of some standing, Sir John Gallop, who lived in a good house facing Chapel Field in Norwich, and who became a frequent visitor to our house. "What are you going to do with that boy of yours?" said Sir John Gallop one day to my father. "I haven't thought of that," was the reply of my father, who was a good kind-hearted man, a genius without energy. "I'm sure I can't say." "Well," said Sir John, "you ought to think of it, for there seems something in him. Why don't you send him to the grammar school founded by Edward VI? "Because I can't afford it." "But I can manage it for you," was the answer. "Every alderman has a presentation to a foundation scholarship. My turn comes next year, but your boy is now at the proper age. I will arrange for an exchange with my friend Marshall. He has twin sons, both of whom he intends to get on the foundation. His turn comes now. He shall nominate your son this year, and I will nominate one of his sons next year." So it was arranged, and I became a foundation scholar. And now a word about Sir John Gallop. He's what is called a self-made man. That is to say, he's not at all self-made, but he was endowed by Providence with those qualifications which, when properly used, produce the so-called self-made man, viz., intelligence, honesty, and steady perseverance. He began life in a goldsmith's shop on Gentleman's Walk in the Norwich market-place as an errand boy. His master duly noted the lad's good qualities, paid for a night school education, made him confidential clerk and bookkeeper, and ended by giving him a partnership. Eventually he himself became sole proprietor and a member of the corporation, and was thrice made mayor. On the third occasion he presented an address to the king, doubtless George IV, and was ordered by the greatest gentleman in Europe and the biggest blackguard in the world to rise as Sir John Gallop. I'm pleased to put these few words down in memory of my earliest friend. To return to my own history. At 7 o'clock one summer morning, I was introduced by a friend, one of my schoolfellows, to that great grammar school which, for so many years, was the scene of my earliest efforts. This young friend's name was Barnes. Many years afterwards, I became acquainted with his eldest brother, then obstetric lecturer at the London Hospital. Not long thereafter, he held the same post at St George's and was soon recognised as the leading gynaecologist in the metropolis. On being admitted to the school, I was located at the foot of the scraps, the lowest pupils in the school, not yet qualified for entry to the first form, the lowest form. In the first and second forms I remained for 3 years, being as a rule entirely neglected by the masters, whose sole business would seem to have been to give no explanations, to flay when necessary, to allot lessons to be learned at home to be repeated parrot-like next morning. The results being a very low standard of progress. Matters went worse and worse, till in about 3 years numbers fell from, say, 350 to an almost inappreciable number, that is, of paying scholars. 60 were removed by their friends in one day, boarders who had made it clear to their parents that it was monotonous to live on rice pudding every day when it was enriched with lumps of suet as big as nutmegs, most of which were thrown under the table as opportunity offered, the surplus being stowed away in trouser pockets to be disposed of in the playgrounds after meals. The headmaster was dismissed. The Reverend Henry Benfather of Sprowston near Norwich was appointed in his place. The Reverend John Bailey of Stoke Holy Cross, one of the junior masters. Of the other 3, 2 were flogging tyrants, and the third was an imbecile who obtained his appointment to teach writing and ciphering, things quite beneath the standard of a great classical school, and were allowed to occupy barely an hour a week. Under the care of the 2 excellent men above, I soon made wonderful progress. At the end of 8 years it was noted that I was in the running for the post of head boy or captain of the school. In fact, there was only one other competitor who found much favour. His name was John Stuart Perrome, son of a Norwich clergyman who had been able to coach him up every evening. The final subjects of our examination were a copy of the original Greek verses to be written in, I think, Sapphic metre, and questions on the person's Latin preface to the plays of Euripides, full of extremely valuable items respecting the highly practical signification of the Greek particles, truly a most essential point of education for a young man about to enter upon real modern life. The fatal day, big with marvellous anxieties, came at last. To my no small delight, I was proclaimed the victor. My mind was then distressed by the prospect that I should have to stand on a platform opposite the school porch, there to speak an oration in Latin to the mayor, sheriffs and corporation on their triumphal procession to the cathedral, where they were to celebrate the memorial service in honour of Edward VI, the founder of the school. But it so chanced that I was the first young man probably for many years from whom no speech was required, for the corporation had decided that this formality took too much valuable time from the arduous outline of city duties, and the procession was struck out. I may here mention with much gratification that my competition, after long and important duties in the University of Cambridge, was a few years back appointed Bishop of Worcester, a post he held until compelled recently by ill health to resign his position. On the expiration of my school term, I was to have gone to Cambridge, but no money was forthcoming, and I decided to leave home and look out for my own maintenance in the busy world of London. While thus reflecting and deciding, a friend much older than myself wrote to me stating that he was resigning a residential mastership of a proprietary school in the then picturesque country district of Tulse Hill, on the border of Lord Thurlow's park, and that, knowing that I wanted something to do, he had named me to the proprietors, who had authorised him to give me the appointment solely on his recommendation. I at once accepted, but the question was how to get out of London. In this difficulty, the father of the man who had been the ruin of my father, lent me £5, wherewith to start my life. Let me here boastfully assert that I had the pleasure of being out of debt within 12 months. I at once started for London, stayed 3 weeks with Mrs. Lay, an old friend of my mother's, whose trustee and executor I was for many years, and on a very snowy evening went to the top of an omnibus to Tulse Hill, where my friend was staying till I should arrive. My youthful and insignificant appearance created a terrible sensation, and the proprietors were proposing to turn me out at once, but my departing predecessor urged them to give me a trial, stating that they would find I was equal to more than they required. My duties commenced next morning. I was to teach reading, writing and arithmetic, lecture on interesting subjects, and give a certain amount of instruction in Latin, Greek and French. At first I was badly treated, but finding that the boys were becoming attached to me and were making good progress, matters gradually softened down, and I felt a little reconciled to my not very laborious duties, relieved as they were by long rambles in the picturesque neighbourhood of Thurlow Park, Gipsy Hill and the wild Dulwich Wood. Meanwhile, how little did I guess what was going on beneath the surface of events, which was so soon to alter the whole current of my existence. The great Mr Fowell Buxton, afterwards first Baronet, was on his way from Rome, where he had been recovering from the fatigues of 19 years in Parliament, during which time, in succession to Wilberforce, he had been enabled to secure the abolition of negro slavery throughout the British dominions, and was now about to tackle the question of the abolition of the slave trade by substituting for it legitimate traffic with natives on the west coast of Africa. To carry out his views, the government had agreed to fit out 3 steamships which were to join and to be known as the Niger Expedition. This being settled, Mr Buxton wrote home in advance, stating that they must find for him a ready-made secretary, his 2 previous annuances being unattainable, one having become his son-in-law and the other having entered the Wesleyan ministry, of which connection he afterwards became the president. Among other persons to whom the family wrote in looking out for a suitable candidate was a Miss Glover, a former governess in the Buxton family but then resident in Norwich. She went at once to her friend Mr Farnell, master of a commercial school, and asked him whether among his past boys he could recommend someone for this berth. "My dear Miss Glover," he said, "you've come to the wrong man. My boys are all trained for commercial pursuits, and as my time is very valuable, I'd better at once say it's useless for us to talk of the matter further, much as I should like to serve you." And shaking hands, he led her to the door, while she went away discouraged. And now occurred the actual fulfilment in practice of quotation which I have never been able to locate. Oh, what small hinges great events do turn! For no sooner had Mr Farnell shut the door than he opened it on its hinges once again and called to Miss Glover to come back. "I have kept," said he, "a record of all the hundreds of boys whom I've educated for the last 30 years, and I have always looked to their future and ascertained the results of their education. This book is in my study. Let us go and look at it, although I fear it's a useless task." Scarcely, however, had he opened the book when he said, "Look here, Miss Glover. You know, or probably you do, that young Nixon, the lawyer's son? Well, 3 or 4 years ago I was talking to his father, remarking that it was a pity that a youth of 16, well up in his classics, should be nearly ignorant of the commonest arithmetic, and barely able to write legibly. Now send him to me every evening, when I can coach him up in what I deem essential requirements, and he can recompense me by giving lessons in Latin and Greek to such of my boys as may want tuition. But I believe he's got an appointment in London. Anyway, you could call on his mother and hear how matters stand." As a result of all that was mentioned to the Buxton family, as to my position at the school, etc., I was required to see Mrs Buxton's eldest son, who asked me at once whether I was prepared to give up my permanent appointment and come to his father for 1 week on trial, retiring at the end of it without notice if I found it unsuitable. "Sir," I said, "I accept the conditions," and returning to Tulse Hill told my employers the state of my affairs. They saw I could not afford to reject such a chance, and I at once proceeded to London and secured an admirable substitute, better qualified than myself, inasmuch as he was several years older and less trained entirely in classics. My employers then behaved well and parted with me on the most friendly terms. I next found myself living in a good house, luxuriously furnished in Upton, a suburb of Stratford, and ready to begin my duties as a private secretary. "Come along, Mr. Nixon," said Mr. Buxton. "I want you now to write a letter from my dictation." I took a sheet of paper, addressed and dated it, and the dictation commenced. "Dear ... there goes with my new secretary." I wrote it and said, "Yes, sir." "But," said he, "I didn't say yes, sir." "No, sir," I rejoined. Then he resumed, "Why did you say yes, sir?" "Well, sir, I said yes, sir, because I had finished." Then he said most kindly, "Young fellow, please remember never to say yes, sir, but repeat the last word, as you do not thus disturb the train of thought of the person who is dictating." And he began again. "Dear, here goes with my new secretary." "Yes, sir," I said, nearly choking myself in my endeavour to substitute the word secretary. At the end of a week we both found we suited. He was the best friend I ever had in my life, and when he died I felt, as I sat upon the bed as one of all the mourners who surrounded him, that I had lost more than either a father or mother or other personal relative. I resume this account on the 32nd anniversary of my birthday, this being February the 15th, 1903. During my 5 years spent with Sir Fowell at Northrop Hall near Cromer, I came to know several persons of remarkable character. For example, Mrs. Elizabeth Fry, Lady Buxton's sister, of whom more hereafter, her brother Joseph John Gurney of Earlham Hall near Norwich, who went to the United States preaching a crusade against the continuance of Negro slavery in the southern states. The celebrated Dr. Moffat, who established the Kuruman Mission Station in South Africa, a place then far outside the region of civilization. It was at the time of Dr. Moffat's visit to Northrop Hall that I was endeavouring to arrange for sending my sister Millicent to Graf Rainet in Cape Colony, with a view to being married to Alfred Thornton, my future wife's second own brother, who had there settled in business. But how was I to get the money? Somehow, I forget how, my difficulty became known to Mr. Buxton, who at once offered to lend me the required sum. I was therefore enabled to provide my sister's passage money and to relieve all difficulty about her voyage. Dr. Moffat, who was about to return to the Kuruman, kindly offered to see her all the way to Graf Rainet, a proposal which I warmly accepted. Eventually, my future wife's elder sister was married to Benjamin William Suckling, second cousin to Lord Nelson, who was going out to join Alfred Thornton as partner in engineering. With them, my sister went in the ship Abbotsford to Algoa Bay, a voyage occupying then 94 days, and her departure was the first bitter pang of sorrow in my life. We never saw her again, for at the end of 10 years she died of malarious fever and was buried in the cemetery of Graf Rainet. From Elizabeth Suckling I received as a last memorial some dust from her grave, which I think I sent to her daughter, Mrs. Morris of King's Lynn. If my recollection serves me aright, the repayment of the loan from Mr. Buxton was made a matter of small difficulty, his noble generosity having insisted upon a large discount. I also knew the Reverend Samuel Growther, the first ordained Negro clergyman of the Church of England, who afterwards at Sierra Leone became the first Negro bishop. I may further mention Dr. Lushington, the judge of the Admiralty Court, who, I believe, was one of the counsel employed to defend the Queen of George IV, who was triumphantly acquitted of the charges brought against her by her husband. With regard to Mrs. Elizabeth Fry, it pleases me to remember that when she was engaged in providing a reading and coffee room for the unemployed fishermen of Cromer, the money for which was chiefly given by Sir Fowell Buxton, she asked me to act with her in selecting and arranging all books which might be deemed desirable, and otherwise helping her as an amanuensis, a task which gave me great pleasure and which in due time was most satisfactorily accomplished. As an indication of my inordinate amount of self-esteem, I desire to mention an incident which at the time gave me great gratification. It was the custom of the country families who visited each other in the neighbourhood of Cromer to arrange for what was called essay parties for the amusement, chiefly of the younger branches of all the families. 2 or 3 years after I entered my private secretaryship, it came to the turn of the Buxton family to arrange the evening's entertainment at Northrop Hall, where the drawing-room would accommodate a large company. Not long prior to the date of the meeting, Sir Fowell said to me, "I have decided about my essay, Nixon. Have you written yours?" "Certainly not, sir," I replied. "I didn't know I was expected to write one." "My dear fellow," he said, "you and I are included in the young peoples of the house, and anyway, I expect you to write one, so consider yourself under definite orders whether you like it or not. When it is written, like the rest of the others, you have to send it in to my daughter Richenda, who, with help, will make a copy of all the papers, so that the authors may not be known until after the papers have been read." Of course, I was much pleased at the attention shown me, for I was not a country family, and I selected for my essay a subject which would commit itself to the recognition and amusement of the entire company. It was soon after it had become known in that part of Norfolk that Sir Fowle's two younger sons, then at college, had been travelling in the Highlands and had been invited by the Marquis of Breadalbane to visit him at Taymouth just prior to Queen Victoria's intended visit, and to shoot the first of the capercaillies, which might be served for the Queen's dinner. I ought to mention that none had previously been allowed to be shot. They were said to have disappeared from the Highlands 200 years before, and Sir Fowle had determined to introduce them again into Scotland. To this end, he selected a keeper who had lived some years in Norway and Sweden, and sent him off with money to buy as many capercaillies as he could secure alive. In due time he returned with 30 couples, which Sir Fowle presented to Lord Breadalbane, who was said to have about 50 miles of pine woods and deer forest, with much bog and moorland abounding in cranberries. The birds throve wonderfully, and when the two young men were told off to shoot the first of them, it was reported by the gamekeepers that the number had risen to about 1,000 head. I determined to immortalise the events to which I refer by inducing the particular bird, which came to the Queen's eating, to give me his own special account, which I therefore incorporated in a divine poem of some good many stanzas, and entitled The Life, Death, and Subsequent Adventures of a Capercaillie related by himself. Now, after these preliminary remarks, I come to the crucial evening when the company had all assembled in the drawing room and the essays were all read out by Miss Buxton standing at a reading desk. Next to me on the sofa sat Miss Ellis Fry, now and then, in her quiet and progressive manner, made remarks to me about the papers, which papers were all received with various intimations of the company's feelings, and it will not be surprising if I say that it was very pleasing to me to hear the applause and remarks with which my paper was received, but it was still more gratifying when Mrs. Fry turned to me and remarked in Quaker parlance, "Friend William Nixon, does thee know who wrote that paper?" "Well," I answered, "of course, Mrs. Fry. If I knew, I should not be at liberty to tell you, as the prize verdict is to be given after all the papers have been voted for by the company, and the name of the prize winner will then alone be made public." "Oh, I remember," she said. "I only asked because if I had to give the prize I should adjudge it to the author of that paper, as above all things I hate personal vanity." It is painful to me to have to state that the Capercaillie's paper was declared to be facile princeps, and the author was required to stand up and, if it had been in Grecian times, would have had to wear the laurel crown. To return to the general subject of my life at Northrop's, I remained there for a year after Sir Fowell Buxton's death, during which time I was engaged in the settlement of his estate and other affairs, and in particular for about 8 months in reading up numberless letters, etc., and in writing out the results of my labours in voluminous accounts of the various public and more particularly philanthropic works in which he had been engaged, such as, for instance, his vast labours for the abolition of Negro slavery in the British dominions, his attempts to destroy the profits of the slave trade, the alteration of the criminal law of this country by the limitation of capital punishment, reducing the punishment by death to 7, previously applicable to about 150 crimes so-called. All of this I handed to Charles Buxton, the editor of Sir Fowle's Memoirs, a book which has been near wherever the English language is spoken. Having now finished my work at Northrop's Hall, I found myself, after 6 years of private secretaryship, again thrown upon the world, and I formed one of the most absurd schemes for the future that had ever entered the brain of a sane man. I had an intense desire to lead the life of a farmer away from the cities and in however desolate a region. I'd gained a somewhat practical experience in the fields around Northrop from the farmers and their labourers, but my capital was not sufficient to start a farm in this country. So I determined to emigrate to America and, on the advice of persons who knew that country, proposed to purchase a small piece of new land somewhere in the then secluded district of Buffalo, as far as I remember. Surely no man was more unfit for the life of an emigrant in a forest clearing hut, much to the distress of my friends and particularly that of my recently married wife. I decided to persevere. Man proposes and God disposes, and in the end it occurred to me that, unfit as I was myself for life in an unsettled country, my wife would be still more so, and I relented so far under the influence of her great distress. Let it be known that should any suitable occupation occur in this country before a certain fixed date, I would try to secure it. And here again, note what wonders were working under the surface of events all quite beyond our comprehension. One evening, about 9 o'clock, when John Thornton, my wife's eldest brother, and myself had been out to see some of his near patients, we found a brown paper parcel directed to myself, containing a letter from Sir Ed Buxton, then forwarded by what was then the only express method. In explanation, let me say that a letter from London did not then come to Norwich or by mail or rail, but to Durham, which was 16 miles from Norwich, and thence by cross-country postcards, I think to Fakenham and thence to Holt, going some 50 miles out of the way to do some 25, a private fee being paid to the driver to deliver the letter as a parcel. The letter told me I was a candidate for the secretaryship of the London Hospital, and that I must be at Immen's Brewery to see Sir Ed Buxton at the earliest moment next day. John Thornton at once remarked, the only plan for catching the early train for Norwich is to drive there in the night, and if we were to start between 2 and 3, you will catch the 6 o'clock train. I will drive you there myself. My old grey will do it in a little over 3 hours. So before 3 we were bowling along at 8 miles an hour, when about halfway there the horse cast a shoe, but no forges were open. In spite of this difficulty, the good old horse took us to Norwich rail station at 20 minutes before 6, and after a grateful goodbye to my brother-in-law, I started and reached London in the usual time, which was then 5 hours. I found Sir Edward had lost no time. He'd written my letter of application, obtained testimonials, and had them printed, and 4 or 5 clerks at the brewery were directing these 1,400 circulars, thus commencing my candidature. I had 3 days of expensive canvassing, for the time of application was close at hand, and then found I was one of 7 selected from a very large number and ordered to appear before the committee for examination. With my heart in my mouth, I heard my name called in alphabetical order, was asked a few questions, and then retired to await further orders. In due course, the then secretary came out and politely dismissed 5 of the 7 candidates, leaving only myself and Mr Rust, also curious to say a native of Norwich, for further examination. We were duly called in and severally told that we should be reported to the governors as the 2 best qualified to receive their votes. Mr Rust went out first, and I was told to stop for a few minutes, when a question from the chairman told me how near a chance it had been of the hour and the man not coming together. You are aware, said the gentleman in the chair, that by the laws of the hospital no person is qualified for the appointment of secretary who at the time of application is under 25 or over 45 years of age. This gentleman who has just left the room is very near the highest margin, while you look so very young that it has just occurred to the committee to ask you distinctly whether you are 25 years old or in your 25th year. Sir, I replied, I have much pleasure in telling you that I was 25 years old exactly 2 months ago. Then, said he, you are accepted candidate. Next morning my only competitor retired in my favour, and in due course I was appointed secretary to the London Hospital in 1846. I held this appointment for 20 years, living in my own hired house at Upton, and thereafter having been appointed house governor in addition to the secretaryship. I lived in the house newly built for the governor at the hospital. The 2 appointments I held for about 10 years, and then, having found the double occupation too exhausting, I retained only the governorship. This lasted for 16 years, when gout finished my business career. 2 months later I became blind, and have so remained. I should have much liked to have been able to put down many details not only of my life at the hospital, but also of various interesting and stirring events in many years previous thereto. I will only say that I organised practically single-handed the grand ceremonial attendant on the reception of the then Prince and Princess of Wales, when His Royal Highness laid the foundation stone of the Alexandra wing, a labour on my part duly recognised by the committee. This was in 1864. 2 years after this, as house governor, I went to live in the house at the hospital, and the same week occurred the great outbreak of cholera at the East End. The brunt of the terrible scourge as to administrative details fell upon myself, and at the end of 2 months I was more dead than alive, but in a money sense the efforts of the hospital authorities were amply recognised by the public. Some few years later it was decided, after I had worked in that direction for 4 years, to build a large additional wing at the east end of the hospital, which the late Queen Victoria opened. The decision to build this very large addition to the hospital was arrived at on the day when I reported that our proper number of beds was 570, while somewhere or other in the building we had 625 patients, that it had come to this, that at the present rate of pressure I should be obliged to order my subordinates, quote, to put up some beds on the tiles. This settled the matter, and Mr Thomas Fowell Buxton at once headed the subscription for a new wing with an offer of £5,000. In a week we had £25,000 in hand, and the work was commenced. If I have time and opportunity allowed me hereafter, I should be pleased to set down some particulars of my outdoor pleasures and occupations which, through a long life, have kept up the balance between one's mental and physical powers, such as mountaineering, etc. But at present I must take it easy, as I do not feel equal to further efforts, which is not surprising considering my great age, and that I ought to now be preparing for a journey to that unknown country from whom no traveller returns. With much gratitude, therefore, to that Providence which has so much blessed me thus far, I append my signature to this rough record, commenced, I may say, at the suggestion of Mr Snellgrove, and intended chiefly for my children, if they ever care to read it. Appendix, dated March the 8th, 1903. I now propose, as opportunity may offer, casually to recall any trifling incidents of my life and habits which it may sometimes interest my family to learn, but which I may chiefly recall because it may gratify myself to bring back from memory scenes and feelings long perhaps almost forgotten. And now as to outdoor amusements and occupations. From about the age of 12 years, my spare time was occupied in rowing on the river Wensum, from which opportunity was always arising through the kindness of a neighbour, Mr Vial, whose rowing boat was always at my disposal. It pleases me to remember that I soon became so proficient with the oar that at 16 years of age I was a member of the crew of the only 8-oared boats which up to that time had ever been seen on the Norwich River. Angling was also a pursuit which gave me great pleasure, but this was chiefly carried on through the kindness of an intimate friend who took me with him, bearing all expenses. This friend's name was Fred Fellows, son of a country gentleman at Ormsby near Yarmouth, owner of Ormsby Broad. This friend constantly took me out fishing in the interesting district of the Broads, chiefly at Wroxham and Halton. I may mention further that he kindly lent me a horse and taught me to ride, and there a few words as to this one of my best friends, and certainly one with whom I was longest acquainted. The interval between our first and last meetings you may gather from these few remarks. When he first met me I was 7 or 8 years old, and sitting on the carpet tying the legs of the table together to make harp strings. He was then about 28, the time of his first visit to my father and mother. He took great notice of me, and we were intimate friends through life, the friendship increasing as we advanced in years. This was the first time I ever saw him. When we last met I was blind and therefore couldn't see him, but he came to Richmond to have a talk and informed me that he was then in his 92nd year. On that, a blazing hot day, he walked up the steep ascent from Richmond Station to Richmond Hill Terrace. This sounds rather like a real friendship. At Northrop Hall, my amusements were chiefly riding and certain amount of shooting with cricket, and much walking in the woods and on the beach. The most interesting ride I ever had was one of 40 miles express, of which here a few words of explanation. The Niger expedition was in course of being formed when the hall letter bag, deposited with us 2 miles short of the post office at Cromer, brought us a letter at 12 o'clock requiring an answer by return, and to avert some mischance to the expedition. Here was a serious difficulty. The mail would by this time be near Cromer, and was due to leave on its way back to Norwich and London at 2 o'clock, while the only person who could give the information required was pheasant shooting some 14 miles away. "The only plan," said Sir Fowell, "is to try an express ride, and I think old Jeremy and you can do it." And ringing the bell, he ordered out the horse for me, the finest animal I ever saw, and one of the best that was ever born. "Now then," he continued, "take a sheet of paper, direct it to London, and put in your pocket an inkstand and some wafers, and then off with you like a flash of lightning, making your way for Beaconsthorpe across country, and when you get past Holt, begin to listen for the distant shooting. Follow the sound and stop the firing. Pocket the reply when written, then off again to Aylsham, and to catch the mail coach there if possible. If it should have gone by, go on 12 miles further to Norwich, and there pay an excess fare to carry the letter on. In such case we should not expect you home till tomorrow." Everything, however, went well, and I reached Aylsham shortly before the arrival of the mail. The good horse required substantial rest and food, and I wanted a little of both myself. I waited on till nearly dark, and on emerging from the inn gateway was accosted by a truly horsey man, a Mr Feek, the celebrated Norfolk horsebreaker, whose speech ran thus: "Well, sir, I'm glad to see you on the grand old hoss. He's the only one as ever ran away with me in a trot without breaking. He do look like paint. Where have you been a-riding him today?" When I explained what he'd done, he expressed his belief that no other horse could have done the distance in the time named. After this, the horse took me to Northrop in grand style, doing his best to run away with me, in which, however, he failed. This was after an express trotting journey estimated at 40 miles. I may say that he ran away in a trot with Mr Edward Forster, the Education Minister, stopping only of his own accord after 3 miles' amusement. His footmarks, measured afterwards near Cromer, showed that every spring covered 9 feet. And now to cricket. I always was a bad batsman, but was nevertheless chosen by Mr Cousins Hardy of Leatheringset Hall, together with my brother-in-law John Thornton, to compete in common with the County Six in the celebrated match with the 11 brothers Coleman, who licked us in grand style. The account of this match was raked up from the recourse of antiquity by the Brighton Society paper when Mr Coleman was made first Major of Hove, he being the son of the third brother. All the names and scores were extracted from the cricket periodical, and I found that with one exception I was the only survivor of the 22. I told the incident to Mr Coleman and asked him if he didn't remember some casual incident in the match. Hardly, was his reply, for bear in mind I wasn't born at the time, for the match took place some 60 years ago. One of the curious incidents of my life was my passage across the River Avon, Clifton, sitting in a small basket suspended from a single wire which started from Durdham Downs. When halfway over, I found myself sitting in mid-air at a height of 240 feet, some 150 feet above the topmasts of a ship then passing out to sea. On reaching the further side, I shouted to the man in charge of the basket that he need not leave it there for the sake of dragging me back again, as I had decided to return to Bristol by the ferry. This was a most unpleasant journey, but as I had been told it was the right thing to do, I did it because I pledged my word and didn't like to draw back, though I didn't like the look of it. At Bristol, I inspected the building of the Great Western steamship, which I believe was the first ever that crossed the Atlantic. She was regarded as a mighty vessel, but was doubtless a mere toy compared with the present great Atlantic liners. While I was engaged in this part of my walking excursions, I went on to South Wales and visited Tintern Abbey. There, in company with 3 other young men, I ascended a ruinous turret staircase and came out on the top of the side wall from which had formerly sprung the roof of the building, which was, I presume, 3 or 4 feet thick. For about 20 feet there was a side rail to enable visitors who liked to walk along and look down on the ground some 70 feet below. The most adventurous young man proposed to go on further, and I went with him, and with little difficulty reached the cross wall at the end, where we sat down to rest ourselves. While sitting there, a most horrible sensation seized me. I felt I was unable to return, and I told my friend the fact. "Oh, pull yourself together," he said. "I feel nothing. Get up and shut your eyes, and I will put out my hand behind you and lead you over." I took his advice, and in due time laid my hand upon the railing and looked around, feeling more dead than alive. This was a foolish exercise, for I was not born to be a bricklayer. It will be observed that I am now proceeding without any definite order or sequence of events, and merely noting items as they casually occur to me. Going back to my earlier days at home, I am led to remark how sometimes good comes out of evil, and how getting drunk very early in life may be beneficial to the grown man thereafter. In my own case, the result occurred in this way. I had been made a very intimate acquaintance when 15 years old with a gentleman double my age, and in many aspects the very opposite of myself, for I was slight and delicate, while he was one of the most athletic specimen of the human race. This was James Wigham, partner in a tobacco factory which belonged to his father in Distillery Street, Higham. He occupied separate apartments in his father's house, and frequently invited me to pass the evening with him, as we were both of us interested in learning French by reading and conversation. One evening he introduced as dessert some lovely little cigars and a decanter of some very seductive fluid with which I was entirely unacquainted. Our French lesson being over, we happened to hit upon a theological debate in which he took the free thought side and I the orthodox. During this debate we indulged freely in the cigars, to which I had hardly become accustomed, and, Following his example, I supped the liquid frequently. I afterwards learned it was milk punch, one of the most powerful of all intoxicants. Meanwhile, the debate progressed so merrily that we became oblivious of the lapse of time, and, as Thomas Shanter remarks, or Burns admitted to make him say so, the pros and cons grew fast and furious, the words were good, the punch luxurious. When all at once I remembered it must be getting late, and I pulled out my pocket turnip, a vast silver watch inherited from my maternal grandmother, and in true Norfolk vernacular exclaimed, "Why, goodness gracious me, 'tis nearly 11. My mother will be frightened out of her wits, 1 and 2, and sitting up for me." I started off for St Benny's Road, the hedges whereof seemed to be peculiarly affected. They sidled about in the most erratic manner, or punched me off the footpath into the middle of the road. I therefore thought it better to pass to the other side, where the houses commenced. Holding by the shutters of which I made my way laboriously through St Bennet Street, Charing Cross, and Pottergate Street, to the door of our house in St Andrews Street. As I had said to Wigham, my mother was waiting up for me, frightened and relieved to see me. I told her the whole history, for I had not lost my senses, but was quite unable to get upstairs without help. In due time I found myself in bed, where I remained until 2 o'clock the next day, rising up a miserable but a wiser human being. Since then, I've had innumerable opportunities for losing control of myself, but I stuck fast to my determination never to drink to excess again, and in the 67 years which have passed since that particular night, no onlooker has ever had to exclaim, "Oh, that man! I should be such a fool as to put an enemy into his mouth to steal away his brains." Have I not proved what a charming thing it is to get drunk at some early period of our lives? Before entering upon any record of my mountaineering experiences, I will state how I trained myself to walk. I lived in the country, 4 miles from the London hospital, and for many years I walked both ways every day. In addition, I took long walks on Epping Forest on Sunday, and I also walked much in London on business as well as during holidays in the country. By these various methods of exercise, I worked up a total of 3,000 miles a year. My great ambition was, however, to climb a mountain, and as soon as possible I visited the English lakes. Bent on economy, I hired a bed-sitting room in a nice villa residence, where from my window I had the gratification, very dear to a Norfolk man, of seeing the celebrated authoress Harriet Martineau every time she came out of the next house to take exercise in the garden. But for now, the mountains. It was a fine Sunday afternoon, the day after my arrival, that I started down the road about 3 o'clock on my way to the district sacred to the memory of Wordsworth, but in my case with the particular intention to get as near as possible to the craggy little mountain summit known as Helm Crag. It was impossible not to be attracted to this particularly single mountain, for, when viewed in one direction, the piled-up rocks on the summit presented a marvellous resemblance to a crouching lion with a lamb lying before it, while viewed from another side it resembled the appearance of a hobbling old woman clad in a long cloak covered with a cowled bonnet. For reasons which will be apparent, I propose to call my first mountain exploit The Romance of Helm Crag. And now for the details. Surveying the lovely scenery before me, I was mainly occupied with the question as to how it would be possible to get to the foot of the mountain, which was some distance from the main road. While thus hesitating, I observed some 100 yards before me what I thought in my difficulty might prove to be a Deus ex machina, a resident of the country. I hurried on to overtake her, and observing that she was singularly well dressed, very smartly but neatly, I inquired whether she could tell me the road to Helm Crag. In polished language she told me she was a stranger in the district and had never made an attempt to reach the foot of a mountain, as such an attempt would only prove a source of aggravation. She had always wished to go up on one, pointing to Helm Crag. "Strange," I remarked, "such has been my desire, and I have this day started to carry the project into effort, or, as the tragic poet remarks, die in the attempt." All this time we went on walking towards the mountain, and her remarks were so pleasing and her manners so charming that I asked her whether she really wished to go up Helm Crag. "Yes," she said, "I would give all I possess to stand upon that summit," pointing to Helm Crag. "Then," I rejoined, "why don't you try? I hope myself to be there within the next 2 hours, and if you'd like to trust yourself to an incompetent guide, I will do my best to lead you to the top also." To my extreme surprise, she at once assented readily, so I surveyed the ground and found we must climb over several of the rough stone walls. I soon found my companion was as active as myself, for we soon cleared 5 or 6 of these rough but not unpicturesque divisions between the fields, our efforts being aided by projecting slabs of rock intentionally left in a diagonal direction up our side and in the same manner down the other, forming a style very common in the district. Clear of these obstructions, we rapidly commenced the ascent over the steep slopes of grass and rocks. In due time we came to the foot of a steep gully filled with ragged boulders matted together by creeping plants and ferns. Here, I concluded, my friend would give me in, and I suggested that she should. But never was there a greater mistake. She, like myself, had one fixed purpose in view, to reach the top, or as near the top as legs, arms, heads, and a resolute will carry her. So on we went, but at the upper end thereof we found a far more difficult task in front of us. This was no other than the formidable pile of rocks forming the imaginary group of the Lion and the Lamb. Here I insisted on her stopping, while, much to her chagrin, I went forward to make a deliberate survey of the perilous rock climb. With great difficulty, with much scrambling, and much to my own surprise, I found myself at length standing on a somewhat flat slab of rock, which formed the specs of the 45-foot. The view surpassed all my imagination of the beauties of mountain scenery. Glorious summits rose on all sides, while a precipice of many 100 feet formed by the side of this craggy pillar opposite the difficult route by which I had ascended. All this time my friend below was calling out to know how I was getting on. On hearing that I was on the top, she exclaimed that she should at once follow me, but I felt that my responsibility was too great to admit of this, so I expressly forbade her to come, adding that if I could get down myself, I might possibly decide to help her to get up also. When I reached her, she was ready to start at once, so ordering her to go first, so that I might be able to instruct her as to what knobs of rock she might lay hold of, while I could put her feet into crevices and other means to hold fast. Eventually we reached the top, and, side by side on a really narrow piece, surveyed the wondrous panorama. She was almost mad with delight, and seemed as if she should prefer not to return to Ambleside at all. But I was more collected, and noticed suspicious clouds rising in one direction, and having read enough of mountains to know that they might at short notice become very troublesome, I stepped backward off the slab like a skilful guide, in such a position directed every step of her descent, going down first as I had in ascending gone up last. On reaching the head of the corrie, I looked around and beheld a fearful cloud rapidly coming from Langdale Pikes, and already casting sheets of water into Easdale Inn. I at once said we must make all possible haste, for if that rain finds us unsheltered it will sweep us off the mountainside, and then what about your smart clothes? So off we went down the breakneck covey, perfectly reckless as to grace of position and mode of progression, and sometimes tumbling in a heap. At last we reached the open grass slopes, and looking out for shelter I noticed to my left an isolated pile of rock, and on its right-hand edge I detected a somewhat narrow shelf which seemed as if made on purpose to reach the other side. Along this with furious haste we scrambled, for the heralds of the storm were upon us, and as we turned the corner a few big drops began to fall. Here indeed was a shelter for the storm, for it was coming up behind us, and not only a shelter but one of marvellous character, for it was a lovely cove, wind and waterproof, while a few rough pieces of rock on the floor seemed to indicate that it had been used by shepherds in the time of storms. No sooner were we in than the rain came down so thickly as to blot out the entire landscape. Our anxiety now was how long it would last, and all we could do was to pass the time in conversation. I thought it right to reprove her for her indiscretion in wandering about with a perfect stranger who might be a brigand or a murderous maniac, and indeed, said I, if I were to push you over the precipice 10 foot in front of us, in a few days nothing would remain but a skeleton picked clean by the carrion crows. She, however, expressed her disbelief in my bloodthirsty instincts, so just like the best of friends, or like Dido and Ionisus in a similar position, we watched the storm as it passed away, which it did almost as suddenly as it had commenced. At the earliest moment we started downwards, but I was not without some forebodings of trouble, for twilight was coming on, and we had far to go on a route yet so little known. In time, however, we reached and climbed over stone walls and got to the road just as the darkness of light proclaimed itself. We now walked very rapidly towards Ambleside, the lights of which didn't appear far distant, and I was just remarking as we reached the first house that I should insist on finishing up the day properly by depositing her safely to her door. "Oh, that," she said, "you cannot now help doing, for this is the garden gate of the house in which I am stopping." "Indeed," I rejoined, "and here is also where I stop." And with this remark I stepped forward and opened the gate and knocked at the door. It was opened by the servant whom I know. The young lady who had previously thanked me for my services walked forward to the end of the passage, while the servant lighted me upstairs to my attic bedroom, and as she was putting a lamp on my supper table, I casually remarked, "Who was that young lady who came to the door at the same time as myself?" "Young lady?" she said. "But there, you're right, sir, for she is quite a young lady. She's been here for 6 weeks, and she's the missus, Scotch lady's maid." Here was the sudden downfall of the romance of Helm Crag. But in truth, she was a real lady, well educated, refined, and intelligent, and in many respects far removed from the social standard of many more aristocratic female of the species, to quote the words of my intelligent old friend Mr Beeton, the baker of Milleng. Obituary. William John Nixon was born at Norwich on the 15th of February 1821 and died at Brighton on the 7th of December 1910, aged therefore nearly 90 years. His father was a solicitor in Norwich, able, kind-hearted and easy-going, the youngest of 12 children. The father of this numerous family was a broad-shouldered, powerful man who at the age of 80 walked from Wisbeach to Norwich, a distance of 30 miles, in order to pay a visit to his son. It was from his mother, however, that Mr Nixon always considered he had derived his own qualities of perseverance and determination, and to this mother he was devotedly attached, and she no less to him. At the age of 10 he entered the Norwich Grammar School, acquiring there, under the Reverend Henry Benfather as headmaster and the Reverend John Bailey, one of the junior masters, a sound classical education that stood him in good stead throughout his life. When he left the school he had won the position of first boy, the second being the late Sir J. S. Perrone, afterwards the Bishop of Worcester. It had been intended that Mr Nixon should go to Cambridge, but when time came his father could not afford it, so he decided to leave home and seek a livelihood in London. His first experience in this direction was a master in a small proprietary school at Tulse Hill, where his duties were to teach reading, writing and arithmetic, lecture on interesting subjects and give a certain amount of instruction in Latin, Greek and French. While thus engaged, Mr Nixon was offered the post of private secretary to Mr Thomas Fowell Buxton MP, afterwards made a baronet, who in succession to Wilberforce had been enabled to secure the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the British dominions, and was now about to take up the question of suppressing the slave trade on the west coast of Africa. He lived with Sir Fowell till his death 6 years later, rendering him, we may be sure, intelligent and unsparing service. He spent several more months compiling material for the memoir of Sir Fowell by his son, Sir Charles Buxton. Sir Fowell must have been a man of finest qualities of heart and brain, and service under him must indeed have been a liberal education. Long after, Mr Nixon wrote, "He was the best friend I ever had in my life, and when he died I felt that I had lost more than either father or mother or other personal relative." On March 31st, 1846, Mr Nixon married Miss E. M. Thornton. The same year a vacancy occurred in the secretaryship of the London Hospital, and Mr Nixon was put forward as a candidate. He was only 2 months on the right side of the minimum age for the appointment, but the strong testimonials that supported him carried the day, the other finally selected candidate retiring in his favour. And from 1846 to 1892 his life was devoted to the London Hospital. In 1866, on the resignation of R.J. Hill, Mr Nixon became House Governor as well as Secretary, only giving up the latter post when 9 years later the duties of the combined office had become too great for one man to perform. It may be mentioned that for many years he had acted as Secretary to the West Ham Gas Company, in whose district he resided, an office the duties of which were more than by no means exacting. This appointment he relinquished upon going to live at the hospital as House Governor. Mr Nixon was a man of large and liberal mind, of unusual power of application and mental concentration, and of the utmost personal probity and humour. His powers of organisation were also remarkable. His heart and thought were always centred upon his hospital, and it is not too much to say that it was mainly owing to his work and personal character that the London hospital enjoyed that public confidence which was always shown it and made it what under him undoubtedly became the foremost charity of its kind in England. His health broke down in 1892 and he was compelled to retire from active life. The hospital of September 24, 1893 contained a full report of the proceedings at the Special General Court of the Governors of the London Hospital, at which Mr Nixon's resignation was accepted, and of the high testimony that was borne on that occasion to his abilities. A handsome retiring allowance was unanimously voted to him by the Governors. The attached appreciative letter appeared in the Times of September 22, 1892, and leaves indeed little of importance to be said in addition. To the Editor of the Times. Sir, an official advertisement in today's issue should not be the only notice to appear in the Times in relation to the retirement of William J. Nixon from the London Hospital. From his first appointment as Secretary in 1846, Mr Nixon brought abilities of the highest order, united to a sense of humour and a warmth of heart seldom surpassed, to bear upon the duties of his position. These abilities would have brought wealth and fame in many walks of life, but Mr Nixon was content to work quietly and unselfishly. No man was ever of a less self-seeking nature of the work he had undertaken, and the result was that the London Hospital gradually became, under his inspiration and management, not only the largest public hospital in the kingdom, but a pattern to all others in efficiency and organisation, while he himself has long been recognised as the model of what an administrator of such an institution should be. In fact, it is not too much to say that it was Mr Nixon's personal genius that brought the London Hospital to its highest point of perfection, and that he should rest assured that his lifelong efforts for his fellow creatures are not unknown or unrecognised by grateful public. I am, Sir, your obedient servant. P.S. The present threat of cholera has often brought to the writer's mind the promptitude with which Mr Nixon realised the position of affairs and the responsibilities of the London Hospital when the last outbreak occurred in London in 1866, preparing the hospital at a few hours' notice as he did for the reception and treatment of large numbers of cholera patients, and thus enabling it to render to the public a service of the highest importance, a service which was eloquently recognised at the time by the Times and the free press generally. The dreadful calamity of total blindness caused by gout befell Mr Nixon, unfortunately, very shortly after his retirement. To a man of his active habits this was of course a terrible trial, but few people would probably have borne it more patiently and unrepiningly. His last 18 years were mostly spent at Brighton, accompanied by a lady companion. For the greater part of his time this was Miss F.M. Hobbs, whom he highly valued. He chiefly spent his time in walking exercise, in listening to the books and newspapers that were read to him, and in retelling his varied experiences. He was himself a well-read and well-informed man, books of travel and adventure being perhaps in his earlier days his favourite reading. He was an admirable viva voce reader, and his reading of the Evangeline of his favourite poet Longfellow, for instance, was always a pleasure to listen to. During his long life he had of course met many people of mark, and his anecdotes and reminiscences regarding them could be of the most entertaining kind. For many years Mr Nixon lived at Upton Place and Belgrave Villas in the Romford Road, Forest Gate, devoting much of his spare time to gardening, in which he excelled. In later years, when the volunteer movement was started, he served in the 5th Essex Corps and became one of its most efficient captains and successful shots. He delighted in fine scenery and had good acquaintances with the Lake District of England and the mountains of Scotland. His favourite hunting ground, however, was Switzerland, where he had spent altogether some 33 summer holidays climbing or crossing most of the chief mountains and passes. A man of slim build, about 5'7" in height, his power of lasting was immense, and would often astonish even those who knew him best. With his guides, as also with the old-time proprietors of the hotel at which he stopped from year to year, he was a great favourite, for his genial manner, no less his sterling character, attracted all who came in contact with him. As already mentioned, Mr Nixon died on the 7th of December. Just a week before, he had caught a chill while taking a short walk and pneumonia set in. His medical attendant and personal friend, Mr W.D. Calvert, also a Norwich Grammar School boy and an old London student, was at once summoned and did all that was possible for him, but his heart had gradually become so feeble that he could not shake off the attack. He was conscious to within a few hours of the last, and was able to recognise the members of his family and others who were at his bedside. He appeared to be quite free from actual pain during his last brief illness, and his final hours were peace itself. Ale atque vale. Hail and farewell. Mr Nixon was buried on the 9th of December in the Extramural Cemetery, Lewis Road, Brighton. The London hospital was officially represented at the funeral by its secretary. Mrs Nixon, with his sons, Alfred and Newton Henry, and daughter, Mrs St Quintin, survive. My name is Keith Smith. William Nixon was also my 3 times great-grandfather, and in doing this project I've discovered a huge sense of pride in my distant relative. He died before he could complete his memoirs, ironic given that his favourite idiom was nothing is certain but the unforeseen. The last update of this record was in or around 1903, some 7 years before his death, and the very last word on them is handwritten, unfinished. For some reason, having been entrusted with them in 2011, it was some 12 years later that I got around to recording them in any meaningful way, but time, fortune and circumstance have collided to allow me the moment to commemorate a man whom I have grown to respect and admire in this task. I suppose that as we get older we begin to look back and wonder if we've done anything of any great value, or that our flapping butterfly wings have caused a hurricane somewhere. We all would feel better to know that we've made a positive difference to the world as we take our final bow, and it took 120 years for this memoir to come to life through the miracle of technology. William Nixon's memoirs are a recording that underlines the triumph of nature over nurture. Although he wasn't poor, William Nixon very much bootstrapped his life and took charge of his own destiny, and it's worth noting that nothing was planned. To quote the legendary musician John Lennon, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." Through my own experience and in the reading of William Nixon's memoirs, it demonstrates that while it's great to make plans, the art of survival is being able to flex and bend to the immediate circumstances. One thing I've learned in life is to do with the word luck. There is a way to read Nixon's memoirs to think that he was very lucky that fate smiled upon him. It may be true, but where does instinct end and luck begin? It could be argued that as we go through life we develop our senses to be able to filter out the white noise and seize the right opportunity at the right time. Luck is the product of experience and opportunity. William Nixon had plans, of course, but the major milestones in his life, working with Mr Fowell Buxton on the abolition of global slavery, the main economic driver of the British Empire and the American economy, and then the governorship of the London hospital during times of incredible strife and need, weren't planned. They were opportunities that came about because of a flap of a butterfly's wings some years earlier that, when the time was right, presented itself and was seized upon. Another point to this, and he doesn't write about it, but can you imagine the adversity that he faced in being part of the disruption to the establishment's lucrative economy while he was playing his role in the dismantling of the slave trade? He must have endured a lot of abuse from those in very privileged positions who didn't want their livelihoods interrupted. William Nixon put public and civic duty above wealth and power. He relished and embraced challenges throughout his life. The unpublished part of his memoirs is the record of his international mountains and passes that he conquered. It was unfinished, but it's a pretty impressive list of every difficult expedition the average person of average means might take in the Alps, the Pyrenees, Scotland and the Lake District. To quote him, "In search of bodily strength and to clear off the cobwebs of the brain." I think that the lesson we can all take away from this is that mountains and obstructions are there to be understood and overcome. Whether we do that is down to opportunity, knowledge and timing. Having done so, the results may come instantly or in future years, but they will always come. They will probably also be unexpected, but this makes them sweeter, because nothing is certain but the unforeseen. But the ability to act on the unexpected is what makes life worth living.